Hey there, welcome to Wildly Domestic. So today I'm going to make a kind of a raw tomato soup. And I know you're thinking, raw soup? How can that be? Because soup is warm and raw things are not usually. But there is a way you could do it. Usually when people want to stay completely 100% raw, they do, they might use their dehydrator to kind of heat it up to the requisite, I believe it's 115, I think it is, maybe 104, I'll have to look that up. But yes, so they can use their dehydrator so you can keep it truly raw. What I normally do is, since I'm not raw vegan, I normally make it and then I might heat it in the microwave, or I might heat it on the stove top. I mean, I do try and say with certain recipes stick to raw ideology, so I might still make it raw on certain times when I eat it, but for the most part, you know, I do heat it up. But it's still a really good vegan or vegetarian recipe. Now, I got this recipe out of a cookbook that I'm absolutely in love with. It's called Living in the Raw. It's by Rose Lee Calabro. And it's got so many great recipes in there. This is about probably the 5th or 6th recipe I've made from that cookbook, which is really saying a lot, because normally for cookbooks I might use them for reference or ideas, but I won't actually cook the recipes directly out of the cookbook. But this is actually sort of modified a little bit. So what we have here is 6 tomatoes, and then she calls for yellow onion, but I've got some green onions here that I picked up today at the farmer's market. So actually, I picked up the tomatoes today too, so everything's local organic. I have some rosemary, which she doesn't call for in the recipe, but I'm going to add in anyway. The recipe is actually a tomato pesto soup, but I don't use pine nuts because I'm allergic to them. So, like I said, I'm just going to kind of modify it a little bit. I'm going to make it more of an Italian tomato soup than a pesto soup. So anyway, we've got our rosemary there, which is fresh, and then our Celtic sea salt, or Celtic sea salt, however you want to pronounce it. Basically, it's the French gray salt. As you can see, it's got a lot more of a thicker texture, and it's also got a higher mineral content than most of the salts you'll see in the grocery store. We've got our minced garlic. We've got our extra virgin olive oil, organic. Yay! The garlic's not organic, but it was on sale. Oregano and basil. Now the recipe does call for like a cup of fresh basil, but I forgot to pick up fresh basil at the store, so I'm using my dried basil, and I'm not going to use a whole cup because I don't think I even have a whole cup, but I'll still put a considerable amount in there because I do want it to be similar to the recipe. So it calls for 6 tomatoes, and here's my blender. And even though you don't necessarily have to cut them up when you're using a blender, to me it just makes it easier and faster for everything to kind of help it on its way, so you don't have to blend it and then break it up or anything like that. So, or you know, if you have like one of those super killer Vitamix blenders, you might not need to. You could just throw stuff in there whole, and it pulverizes it to a wonderful soupy paste for you. But with my blender, it is a little older, but that's perfectly fine. It does me good. I'm just going to make sure I cut up my tomatoes ahead of time. So there we go, and I'm also going to blend them in bits and pieces here. So there we go. So I'll toss some of my tomatoes in here so we can get started. And it also called for, the recipe called for a cup of homemade cucumber celery vegetable juice. But I decided to just use water instead, even though I'm sure the cucumber celery juice would have been a lot more, added a lot more flavor, and you know, obviously it'd be good for you because you're getting your extra vegetables in there. But I don't have any cucumbers or celery, and also my juicer, as much as I love it, I don't know if any of you have juicers, but to me I find them to be kind of a pain in the butt to clean, even the easiest ones. So this recipe also does call for sprouts, and since we just finished sprouting our fresh sprouts, I'm going to get those out of the fridge. And I'm going to pour my water in here. There we go. I do find that when you make sure you have your liquid in there, it does help things blend a little easier than if you're just trying to do the thick ingredients on their own. That's more food processor territory, and the food processor isn't going to get it to be the nice consistency that we want. It's going to be thicker in there. So let's see. It's 1 tablespoon of virgin olive oil. So like I said, I'm putting my liquids in here. There we go. 1 tablespoon. Set that down right there. If it'll stay. Alright. I'm going to throw the rest of my tomatoes in here. Whoop, 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 whoop. And Whit didn't want to stay after all, so we're just going to... There we go. I'll put it in the measuring cup. That way it'll stay in one spot. So... we've got all our tomatoes in here. So we're going to take a brief blending interlude because this will be loud and it'll take a minute to get everything to the right consistency. So we'll be right back. Okay, so as you can see here, we have kind of a nice, pretty sort of pinkish color from the tomatoes and the olive oil and the water. It also calls for 2 cups of sprouts. Now, like I said, these are the sprouts that I made, and it is in a bowl jar, which normally has measurement markings on it, but this one doesn't. So, now looking at my measuring cup here, I can see that that's 2 cups. So I have just about 2 cups of sprouts right here in this jar. So we're going to pull these out of my jar. And of course that means I'm going to have to sprout a whole new batch, but I don't mind. I actually enjoy it. So not a big deal. And I'll put that in the sink so I can rinse that for the next batch. Okay. And we're going to throw in our green onions. Now, the recipe calls for 1 whole yellow onion, but like we said, I'm using green, so I'm just going to cut about half of these pretty stalks up. You see, it's about down to half where it was before. That way I can still use the rest of those for other recipes. I'm just going to mince this up a little bit nicely. And now obviously with different sorts of onions are going to give you different flavors for when you cook. Sometimes yellow onions do tend to have a bit of a sweeter taste, and the red or purple onions I find them really good for Mexican foods and things like that, because they have a very pungent, like a pungent kind of, not quite garlicky taste, but a little bit closer to that spectrum, more savory. And then of course you've got your sweet vidalias, and then the yellow ones, the white ones, which are similar to the red ones as far as pungency, but not quite as strong. And then we've got our nice green ones, which do give a much more herby sort of vegetable-like taste to it. I think it gives it a more fresh taste. That's also really conducive to using in Mexican and Latin food recipes as well. So we've got those in there. My hands are rinsed. And before I blend it again, I'm going to throw in the rest of my seasonings. So it calls for, let's see here, a 1/4 teaspoon of oregano and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Okay, we can do that. Alright, so let's get my 1/4 teaspoon out. There we go. Now usually when I'm doing stuff, when I just pour it into the little teaspoon thing, I'll do it over the recipe, so that way, A, it kind of prevents there from being any sort of mess for me to clean up on the counter or anything like that. and B, that way I'm getting part of the seasoning already in the mix. So might be a little bit more oregano than I intended, but that's okay. And where's my salt here? I'm going to wipe that off because I got a little oil on that. And I don't want to get the oil in the salt. So I'm using a bit of a heaping teaspoon there because I like things to be salty. But with the Celtic salt and the Himalayan salt, you really don't have to put as much in as you would use with regular table salt like Morton's or anything like that, because it does have a stronger, saltier flavor to it. So a little bit does go a long way with the whole salts like that, with the Himalayan and the Celtic, or otherwise known as French Grey. Alright, as I mentioned before, it does call for a cup of basil, but obviously I don't have a whole cup of basil here, so I'm just going to put in 2 teaspoons, or excuse me, tablespoons. So, big heaping tablespoon there, and another big heaping tablespoon. I probably should have just popped the shaker top off and poured it out. That would have been probably a little less time consuming, but you know what, it's okay however you want to do it, however, whatever makes you happy. And since those tablespoons were a little short, I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit extra in here, because I do want it to have a nice sort of pesto-y taste to it, despite the fact that I'm not using the fresh basil and I'm not using a full cup of it. So this probably does, when all is said and done, equal out to closer to 2.5 tablespoons than just the 2 tablespoons. Oh, sorry, there's a bit of tomato on my finger. I was eating it. Okay, and then lastly, we're going to put our garlic. Now, I'm a big fan of garlic, and this recipe calls for 3 cloves of minced garlic. Now, I believe that, let's see here, half a tablespoon, yes. The nice thing about when you get the jars of minced garlic, it tells you right on here how much is equal to 1 clove. So since we're using 3 cloves, we're going to use a teaspoon and a half, because a half a teaspoon equals 1 clove. So I said tablespoon before, excuse me. It's a fresh jar, so I'm going to open it with my, that's a tough one. Finally! Good Lord, that was the hardest jar ever! Okay, so we have our garlic here. We're going to add that in. It's a fresh jar, and we're going to put our teaspoon and a half in there. I'll just wipe off that teaspoon. So there's our big heapy teaspoon, and instead of using the half teaspoon, even though that would probably provide me a bit more accurate measurement, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it with my 1 teaspoon. Put that in there, and then put those in the sink to wash for later. And then lastly, we've got the rosemary. Now, I've got 2 stalks of rosemary here, and it is fresh, but it's I dried it out a little bit, so that way it's easier to use. And basically, I'm just going to pull all the little leaves off these 2 stalks and put it into the soup, or the soon-to-be soup. On its way to be soup, pre-soup, if you will. Okay, there we go. Now, with all the garlic and the onion and the oregano and the tomato that we're putting into this is going to be great for building your immune system. And if you have a cold or anything like that, you feel like you're coming on fighting off that. Because obviously tomato is super high in C and antioxidants. And then oregano is actually got antibacterial and antiviral properties. Now the small amount that we're putting in probably isn't enough to really kind of fight that off, but you can get straight oregano oil that is super, super potent. And of course, garlic and onion also have antibacterial properties, as well as rosemary. So we have all the rest of our ingredients in there. We're just going to put the lid back on and blend it up. So we'll be right back when that's done. Alright, so we're done blending. Now, as you can see, it doesn't really look like a conventional red tomato soup. Because a lot of times the red color comes from, depending on what company you get it, either actual food coloring or when you cook tomatoes, it kind of releases that flavor. Also, part of what makes this not red is the fact that we've mixed all these other sort of green ingredients in it, so you get sort of this almost a tan color, which may not look particularly appetizing, but it does taste really good. So we're going to do a quick taste test here. Get a spoon off the drying rack up here, and just right out of there. As you can see, it is kind of a nice sort of thick soup consistency, and it should heat up very nicely if that's what you intend to do with it. That's really good. It tastes very fresh. You can definitely taste that there is tomato in there. It's got kind of a Italian gazpacho thing going on. So if you wanted to, you could just go ahead and serve it cold or room temperature like this. You could serve it straight out of that, or you could just chill it for about a half an hour or an hour or so and serve it cold. But that is very good. And that is our raw soup. So thank you for watching, and you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.